Hello, everyone. I'm excited to have a very special guest today. So I'm going to invite Priya. Thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to talk all things constipation.
My name is Cristina Montoya. I'm known as the Arthritis Dietitian because I love empowering women with rheumatoid arthritis and Sjögren's disease to improve their overall health through evidence-based nutrition and practical lifestyle tips. Andrea is a registered dietitian from Calgary, Canada.
No, I live the majority of the time in Mexico, actually. So it's really sunny. I know Calgary's freezing right now. So sorry to anybody. You're in Ontario, so I'm sure it's cold there too, right?
And yeah, we have a snowfall today and it's been very cold, but that's okay. I guess we switch. I'm from Colombia and you're in Mexico now. Andrea, you are awesome because you specialize in gut health and gastrointestinal diseases. Andrea is also recognized in the media's Canada's gut health expert. Using her skills and evidence-based knowledge translation, she empowers Canadians to make lifestyle changes to support a healthy gut. So super excited to have you here, Andrea. Now, what inspired your work as a dietitian focusing on gut health?
I have a private practice in Calgary and a team of dietitians across Canada that help people with digestive issues. Our primary patients are people with digestive issues. I personally became interested in functional gut disorders because I struggled with irritable bowel syndrome at a time where there wasn't a lot of research about it. When I was diagnosed, it was kind of that condition where everybody thought it was all in your head. Through my own experience, diving into the research as a dietitian, I always had my colleagues ask me questions about irritable bowel syndrome because they knew I'd know the answer. When I started my private practice, I knew this was an area that could help people. And I'm very passionate about functional gut disorders or disorders of gut-brain interaction, where we know everything's structurally right and people are left with a diagnosis where maybe they feel like a lot of times people don't feel like it's real or that there isn't a lot to be done to help them, when in fact, there's so many things we can do for so many different functional gut disorders. And of course, one of them is constipation.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that your recent ebook, Backed Up, The Ultimate Guide to Overcoming Constipation. I talked to you before, my main audience, people with autoimmune diseases, especially people with Sjögren's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. And one of the things that I always try to tell my patients, constipation, not only as a result of IBS, but we also, when we're in a flare-up, we tend to take a lot of opioids or pain medications. We tend to eat less because we just don't have the energy to eat. And so it's beyond the IBS spectrum. The constipation has so many other causes. And you tell us how is constipation defined and why is it more than just eating more fiber and drink more water?
Absolutely. So I think one thing that might surprise people is constipation is actually subtype. There are several subtypes of constipation. So if you've gotten a diagnosis of functional constipation, you should probably also get a subtype along with that so that you understand what might be contributing to your constipation. And so medication-induced constipation is a subtype. When you're living with an autoimmune disease or a chronic disease, a lot of times pain medications are used to help manage. And like you said, of course, when you're not feeling well, you're going to eat less. I have an autoimmune disease myself, and I didn't realize until I started to have problems with it. The foods that I want to eat in a flare-up are typically not my high fiber regular diet. Mm-hmm. I tend to gravitate more towards simple carbohydrates to keep my energy up when I don't feel like eating. I assume that's a common thing for people with autoimmune. With understanding your constipation subtype, you can better determine what strategies are going to be most helpful for you in a flare. So if it is medication-induced constipation, when you start medications for your pain, do you have a plan to help manage that constipation? How severe does it typically get? And what sorts of things can we layer in to help? In terms of definition, for functional constipation, it's less than 3 bowel movements a week, greater than 25% of those bowel movements being Bristol stool scale type 1 and 2, which is the harder stools, difficulties with defecating or needing manual maneuvers like supporting your pelvic floor, so using a squatty potty to facilitate a bowel movement. We talked about frequency, consistency, manual support, and lack of incidence of diarrhea without medication. A lot of people think, okay, I'm having harder stools, but I'm going every other day. So that's not quite the definition of constipation, but I'm still very uncomfortable. That's something I'd like to point out. A lot of times you might not check all those boxes for functional constipation, but if there's an element of discomfort associated with the constipation, there's likely things that we can do to help manage that.
When a patient comes and go to the doctor and say if they're diagnosed with constipation, I don't think the patient will go and say, what subtype am I? So how can they navigate that when it comes to getting the proper constipation diagnosis and treatment?
Right. One of the big ones is pain a predominant feature of your constipation. If it is, you might fall into that IBS-C category. If you utilize medications to help manage pain, for example, or if you are on medications that are known to slow your bowels or harden your stool consistency, then that could be medication-induced constipation. If there is any issues with, your pelvic floor, that could be related to dysnergic defecation or inability to properly facilitate a bowel movement. So there's lots of kind of different clues, and it does typically take a full assessment by a physician to help sort that out. I do have a great quiz that asks some pointed questions and specific symptoms so that you can go to your doctor and say, well, I checked these boxes for these symptoms. Could we possibly look at these causes for constipation? I'll make sure I share that quiz for you guys.
It's very helpful to come to the doctor's office. You have the evidence and information to help the physician navigate your concerns better. Thank you for that. You mentioned quite a few causes of constipation. That is just not about have more fiber, more water. But what would you think is probably one of the causes of constipation that people don't really think about?
I find constipation is very multifactorial. People don't fit into one particular box. Sometimes it is fiber related, and hitting fiber targets or using a strategic fiber supplement like psyllium or partially hydrolyzed sorghum is adequate to resolve that constipation. But a lot of times people try that and it's not adequate. So then where do they go from there? A lot of times, layering on various strategies help with constipation management. Using over-the-counter remedies or prescription remedies can be helpful. All of those sorts of things can help contribute to kind of resolving that constipation.
One thing that I learned through my own health journey was pelvic floor physiotherapy. I was very surprised to see that not only even with urine incontinence, actually also with constipation. How do you advocate for that sort of treatment and, ask for that stuff?
100%. And a lot of times people don't realize that your pelvic floor, lots of people think, okay, pelvic floor is a postpartum issue for people that have given birth and then they have urine incontinence. If I jump on a trampoline, I got to be very careful kind of thing. Our pelvic floor actually plays a really important role in facilitating a bowel movement. It needs to properly relax to allow the stool to move through. At the same time, you actually need your sphincters to be adequately coordinated, and you need your diaphragm to move down to increase your intra-abdominal pressure. There's a lot going on when we facilitate a bowel movement. And if any of that chain is off, you can actually struggle with a defecation disorder, which is inability to pass stool because of something in the mechanical process going wrong. In terms of diagnosis, there are medical tests that you can do to work that up. However, I find specifically in Calgary, and my dietitians find who practice in other provinces, a lot of times they're not accessible. I find the best way to start for a lot of people is actually being assessed by a physiotherapist trained in pelvic floor physiotherapy. They can assess properly how you move your pelvic floor, especially when you go to start to facilitate a bowel movement. Pelvic floor issues aren't just impacting women who have had children. They're impacting everybody. So men can have pelvic floor issues too. I find especially those who have been in a car accident or had an athletic injury, especially if it's back related, can actually struggle with pelvic floor issues. Some clues there I find tend to be that they can only pass stool when it's a really specific consistency, or they have the right consistency of stool, but it's kind of those pencil thin stools where they don't feel completely evacuated after. They need that pelvic floor support, so their knees above their hips to even think about being able to open their bowels. So there's lots of kind of different clues there. Do I need a pelvic floor workup? But in general, if people don't respond to the constipation basics and they're having troubles passing stool regardless of consistency, then that's a big red flag for me to get a pelvic floor assessment.
So here we have EP Abuela. Any herbal tea you might suggest to help with constipation?
Yes, both peppermint and ginger are actually efficacious in improving motility in the bowel. So they are smooth muscle relaxants. In addition, what's really unique about hot liquids is it helps to stimulate something called our gastrocolic reflex. So when we consume things, our nervous system actually communicates to the gut, okay, it's time to start moving things along. So warm liquids, tea, coffee, can actually help to stimulate that gastrocolic reflex and help with a bowel movement. Of course, the ginger and the peppermint act as smooth muscle relaxants and can help to move the bowels along as well. But just the fact that it's a hot liquid can help too.
Oh, so Good reason to enjoy a cup of coffee in the morning, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so funny because lots of people are worried about consuming coffee, and coffee can be such a valuable tool in managing constipation. It's not only a hot liquid, but some of the chemical components of coffee help to stimulate the bowels as well, including caffeine. All of that can be really helpful in making sure that you're going regularly.
No, that's true. So the Lisa, my RD, helped me get off of regular meals use by understanding that I actually wasn't eating enough or the right mix of food enough, like meals with protein, vegetables, and carbohydrates. That's a really good point because sometimes we don't pay attention to the volume that we actually eat,
Right.
consume it, right?
Yeah. So this isn't actually in the actual medical subtype. So we added in the book is constipation related to underfeeding. This is a big one because a lot of people, when they're bloated or when they're sick, they restrict their intake. And when they restrict their intake, they're just not getting enough of the things that their bowels need to facilitate regular bowel movements. And then they get more constipated. And it creates this perpetuating cycle. As well, if you're constantly under eating, whether that's due to your chronic disease or you're restricting, your body just doesn't have the energy to prioritize to digestion. It's going to prioritize your heart, your brain, your muscles if you're using them, and then your digestion gets left behind there. So adequate intake is really important for the muscles in your digestive tract to work.
I have to ask you this. So what do you think about that carnivore diet?
I don't think much about the carnivore diet. I mean, we have piles and piles of evidence to show that a diet that's high in animal products contributes to things colorectal cancer, and a diet inadequate in fiber also contributes to chronic disease and more autoimmune flare-ups and all of those sorts of things. And so carnivore diet is really dangerous in terms of your overall health long term. People will say, well, I actually felt better when I was eating that way. And so I think it's really important to actually suss out if that's you and you're like, oh, shoot, I did the carnivore diet and I feel good on it. It's actually sussing out what symptoms for you resolved. Why do you feel better? And can we incorporate, more fruits, more vegetables, more fiber back into our diet in a way that's not going to exacerbate your symptoms? Because I find that people that are choosing to do the carnivore diet may have been on the flip side of things. Maybe tend to be people that follow those diet trends. So maybe they followed like a really plant-based diet, really high in fiber. Sometimes people that eat tons and tons of fiber do feel more bloated and gassy because of the fermentation. So having a more moderate approach to fiber that's going to work for them makes sense. Or maybe they followed, other types of diets that are really high in FODMAPs, for example. A lot of what's included on the paleo diet would be typically some of those higher FODMAP foods. It might not actually be what you think causing your symptoms, is what I'm trying to say. The carnivore diet is not something I'd ever recommend. And if you're getting symptom benefit from it, let's get to the bottom of why.
Yeah. And I appreciate that comment. And the reason I ask is because the carnivore diet is highly promoted for individuals with autoimmune diseases. And so we're looking for relief, right? Anything that can give us some relief. And if that will give you that temporary relief, oh, let's do it. But I don't if you look at the long-term consequences of those interventions, then I think Lisa also brings up a very good point about the Whole30 that result in her then getting aphasia from terrible constipations. So some of these diets make that worse. So it
Absolutely.
Another question that I get often is about the intermittent fasting. So for both our autoimmune disease and also for gut health. So what evidence can you share about this intermittent fasting?
Yeah. So there is a bit of evidence that suggests that intermittent fasting may be helpful in certain conditions. So it's been a while. I actually did a podcast with this Susan Devcoda on the Let's Get Real podcast. And she did some research specifically in inflammatory bowel disease and intermittent fasting. However, I find, from a practical, so the evidence isn't strong at all. It's very scant. And it goes both ways. Like sometimes I see benefit in some of the studies, small studies, maybe not well-designed studies, and lots of times they don't. So when we think of intermittent fasting, a lot of times people tend to not eat breakfast. They skip breakfast and they start their eating occasion later. And what I find with that is that you're missing out on an opportunity to consume what is typically a very well-balanced, highly nutritious meal. My problem with intermittent fasting is a lot of times people are actually short on fiber intake because they're missing their typical breakfast foods that would be high in fiber. And so missing that eating occasion, they're missing an opportunity to nourish their bodies. It's not something I typically recommend for gut health. However, some people inherently do follow that eating pattern before intermittent fasting was cool, they called it just skip breakfast. And so some people can follow that eating pattern and it works for them. But I always focus on, okay, we need to make up that nutrition elsewhere. How are we doing it? And are we doing it in a way that hits our fiber targets, gets in enough whole grains, gets in enough fruits, gets in enough vegetables, gets in enough protein? Because we don't want to undernourish our bodies, especially when we're dealing with autoimmune conditions.
Yeah, well said there. Thank you. Now, if you can name 5 and maybe how to manage constipation that people can implement today.
Sure. So I'll start with some nutrition ones. Number 1 would be implement a fiber supplement that is strategic. 2 of the ones with the strongest evidence are either partially hydrolyzed sorghum or psyllium. We have very good evidence to show that those fiber supplements can help to resolve or improve constipation. They're a great way to bridge the fiber gap, and they take specific actions on the bowel. So they help to soften the stool and they improve transit time, meaning how quickly things move through your gut. Number 2 is making sure you get in enough fiber, whether that's using a tracker app to see if you're hitting your fiber targets of 25 to 38 grams a day, or just trying to include whole grains throughout the day, fruits, vegetables, and a serving of pulses or nuts and seeds. Each eating occasion should include a higher fiber food, at least one. So getting in enough fiber from food, fiber supplements. The third one is always to include like a constipation superfood. So certain foods have really special effects on the bowels. And in my book, I go through, I have a whole list of constipation superfoods. Something came in, black licorice the other day. I was like, I should have added black licorice to the list. But there's lots of foods that help facilitate a bowel movement, either by softening stool, pulling water into the bowel, speeding up motility. So including at least one constipation superfood, whether it's, some of my favorites are like 2 kiwis or 5 or 6 prunes or a tablespoon of ground flax or a pear. My mom, I think she's listening, black licorice. So there's lots of those foods you can include. Try to include one a day because that's going to help with your stool consistency and your bowel movement frequency. The 4th one is movement. I think movement's really underrated in terms of helping to facilitate a bowel movement. It really creates that mechanical force, so to speak. So walking, running, weightlifting, yoga, those sorts of things will help to ensure that you're getting the movement to help facilitate a bowel movement. And then lastly, the 5th tip, I'd say positioning when you go to the bathroom. So making sure your knees are above your hips. If you can take a few deep belly breaths, really stretching your diaphragm before you have a bowel movement, that's going to help with some of the mechanical things that need to go on to facilitate. And when you have a bowel movement, I had a viral reel where I just talked about how when you facilitate a bowel movement, it's not like forcefully holding your breath and pushing. It's actually blowing through a straw is what it should feel like. And then you can kind of feel your pelvic floor drop and it relax. So if you can kind of feel that, all that sort of your whole diaphragm, pelvic floor drop. So those are my 5 tips, 3 nutrition tips, 1 movement tip, 1 positioning tip to kind of get you started in the right direction.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, thank you so much. I think one thing that also is also key is just when you have the urge, just go.
Oh yeah. Don't withhold stool because that creates a whole other host of problems with stool withholding, losing sensation. When you gotta go, you gotta go. You should go.
And all I say, honestly, just the one thing everybody does in this world is poop.
100%.
Everybody does it.
And yeah, so in the book, we actually have an amazing tracking tool and we have a script that you fill out and you take to your doctor. So, because you don't get that much time with your doctor, you want to deliver the information you need to deliver to get the treatment that you need. So we actually have a script in the book that you fill out and, you can actually be the best advocate for yourself when talking to your doctor about constipation.
Well, that's great. Now, thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge with us. Please let us know where to find you, your website, your social media. And I hope next time we can do this in Spanish, Andrea.
Sí, necesito practicar, pero we can. ¿Podemos? Sí, podemos.
Maybe.
I'm working on it.
No, muy bien. Podemos conversar un día. Un día de eso.
Gracias. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much. And enjoy the rest of your warm and sunny day.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.